Las Vegas, 1970. The Strip was glowing like a carnival that never slept, but Elvis Presley had slipped away from the glitter. Hours earlier, he'd shaken the walls of the International Hotel, his voice echoing through a sold-out crowd. Now, instead of champagne in a gilded suite, he wanted something ordinary, a plate of food in a diner where nobody bowed or cheered. He pushed through the glass door of a roadside restaurant, dressed not in rhinestones but in a plain jacket. The room barely noticed him at first. A few whispers rippled through the booths. Was it really him? The king of rock and roll sitting under buzzing neon lights, sliding into a cracked vinyl seat like any other man? The air shifted when a young waiter approached, pad in hand. Elvis gave his order in that unmistakable southern drawl, the one critics had mocked for years. The boy smirked, then repeated the words in an exaggerated mimic, loud enough for everyone to hear. A few uneasy laughs broke out, the kind that sting more than open insults. And in that moment, the room froze. Would the most famous man in America let himself be humiliated in front of truckers and tourists? Or would he remind them, without a stage, without a microphone, why his voice had carried further than anyone else's? Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The desert night pressed against Las Vegas like a velvet curtain stitched with restless neon. Beyond the Strip's glittering facades, the city hummed with its own nervous pulse. The shuffle of gamblers, the clink of cheap glass, the uneven laughter of tourists who had stayed too long and lost too much. Somewhere above it all, a billboard still flashed his name in gaudy lights. Elvis Presley. Live tonight. He had just left that stage. His hair was still damp with sweat, his chest still carried the echo of the last note, but the roar of thousands was already dissolving in his ears like smoke scattered by the desert wind. Inside his suite, he might have had champagne, expensive perfume, the adoring gaze of people who would say anything just to be close. But none of that filled him tonight. He craved something simpler, something so ordinary it would sting with its very plainness. A place where no spotlight followed, where the walls smelled of fried onions instead of cologne. That hunger drew him away from the Strip, into a district where neon flickered tiredly above sagging awnings. His Cadillac rolled past shuttered motels and pawn shops. Finally, he stopped before a diner that leaned against the night like a stubborn relic. Its red neon sign sputtered the word "Eats" in weary rhythm, one letter half dead. The parking lot was littered with dusty trucks, their chrome dulled by long highways. He hesitated before entering, feeling almost guilty, as though he were sneaking away from the world that insisted he remain larger than life. But he pushed the glass door open, and the bell above it gave a thin jangle. Inside, the air carried a grease-thick warmth. The floor tiles were scuffed, the booths patched with tape, the jukebox in the corner silent and dusty. A handful of men in work shirts hunched over coffee. Two truckers nursed pie and cigarettes. A couple of lost-looking tourists flipped through maps they could barely read. No one turned their head immediately. That, he realized, was the relief he had come for. Sliding into a booth by the window, he lowered his shoulders, trying to make his frame less conspicuous. He wore no sequins, no cape tonight, just a plain jacket and dark slacks. To anyone without careful eyes, he might have been just another man traveling through Nevada. Yet he could feel the stares trickling in, cautious at first. Someone whispered. A spoon clinked against porcelain a second too loudly. A waitress glanced his way, eyes widening before she quickly looked down. The disbelief was palpable. If this truly was him, why would he be here of all places? Shouldn't he be surrounded by gold trim and velvet curtains? He kept his gaze steady on the table's laminated surface, tracing the scratches carved there by restless hands. He wanted to belong to this room, if only for an hour. The order came in the form of a young man, scarcely older than 20, with rolled sleeves and a drawl hardened by this desert town. He held a notepad loosely, like he couldn't care less. "What'll it be?" the boy asked, his tone clipped with the practiced indifference of someone who'd seen every kind of stranger. Elvis lifted his eyes. The fatigue in them was softened by that old Southern gentleness. He spoke slowly, the vowels long, his Memphis roots impossible to conceal. "I'll take a cheeseburger, son. Freeze, and just coffee." Black. The syllables stretched in the quiet. A few of the men in the diner leaned subtly closer. The waitress froze mid-step. The boy tilted his head, smirk twitching at his mouth. Then, loud enough for the whole diner to hear, he mimicked, "I'll take a cheeseburger, fries, and coffee, Black." He dragged the vowels in exaggerated mockery, curling them into something cartoonish. A few chuckles broke out, uneasy and half-hearted. One of the truckers let out a laugh, then hid it behind his hand. The tourists smiled nervously, unsure whether to play along. Another man, older, gave a disapproving shake of his head but said nothing. Elvis did not move. His hands remained folded on the table, fingers resting lightly against each other. His face betrayed no anger, no smile either. He only watched the boy, his eyes calm, unblinking. The silence that followed was heavier than the stale air. For some in the room, the joke had crossed into something uncomfortable. For others, it was the thrill of testing whether this man was truly who they thought he was. Elvis sat still, but inside, a tremor stirred. That accent had followed him all his life. In Tupelo classrooms, they had laughed at the way he pronounced words, called him poor white trash. In Memphis, early on, producers warned him to clean his speech if he wanted respect beyond the South. Now, even here, after all the gold records, the screaming crowds, the millions who sang along to his voice, the mockery still found him. He lowered his gaze to the coffee-stained menu before him. He wasn't angry yet, but the weight of old wounds pressed quietly, insistently, against his chest. The boy scribbled nothing on his pad, still grinning at his own performance, before turning away. But the room had shifted. Conversation died to a murmur. Forks paused midway. Everyone waited, half ashamed, half thrilled, for what would happen next. Elvis remained perfectly still. He could have left, vanished into the night with a slammed door. He could have snapped, demanded respect, reminded them who he was. Instead, he simply sat, his silence louder than any retort. And the diner, suddenly, was no longer just a shabby roadside stop. It had become an arena, filled not with stage lights, but with the sharp, expectant eyes of ordinary people. The laughter had died almost as quickly as it had been born. What remained was the echo of it, a sour aftertaste that hung in the room heavier than cigarette smoke. Cups were set down too softly. Chairs creaked with bodies leaning forward just enough to see, without appearing to stare. It was as though every person inside that diner had silently agreed to hold their breath. The young waiter lingered behind the counter, flipping his notepad idly as though proud of himself. His grin was meant to be careless, but even he could feel the odd stillness he had created. At the booth by the window, Elvis sat with the poise of a man who had been stared at his entire life, though never quite like this. He didn't flinch. He didn't speak. His stillness had gravity, and the longer he remained unmoved, the more oppressive it became. The tourists exchanged uncertain glances, recognizing the face they had seen on countless record covers, but doubting their own eyes. The workers shifted in their seats, some embarrassed by the waiter's boldness, others tempted to laugh again just to break the tension. But no one dared. The silence thickened, demanding someone, anyone, to puncture it. It was an older man who finally did. He rose stiffly from a corner table, his limp obvious in the way one leg dragged slightly behind the other. His hair was close-cropped, streaked with gray, his jaw lined with the kind of stubble that spoke less of neglect and more of a man who didn't need to impress anyone anymore. A faded army jacket hung from his shoulders. He planted himself firmly between Elvis and the young waiter, his voice carrying the weight of someone who had long since stopped caring about winning approval. "Son," he said, his tone low but sharp enough to slice through the silence, "do you know who you're talking to?" The boy shrugged, pretending disinterest. "Looks like any other fella to me." The man jabbed a finger toward Elvis without breaking his gaze. "That fella has given this country more than you can measure. When I was out in Korea, and the mud was up to our knees, and the nights were cold enough to kill, it was his voice on the radio that reminded us what home sounded like. You hear me?" He carried America in his throat. The words struck the room like a hammer. Some nodded instinctively, recalling their own memories. Others simply looked at Elvis anew, as if rediscovering him not as a performer, but as a fixture of their lives, woven into their own private histories. Elvis didn't move, didn't acknowledge the defense. His gaze was still locked on the waiter, calm but piercing, like the surface of water concealing an undertow. The boy's smirk faltered, then returned twice as sharp, brittle with defiance. "Funny, I don't see no crown. Don't look like much of a king to me." He let the words hang, his laughter forced, louder now, as if he thought volume could make them true. The chuckle he forced out was ugly in the silence. Nobody joined him. The veteran's jaw tightened, his eyes darkened, but before he could speak again, Elvis shifted slightly in his seat. Just enough to reclaim the air around him. He still didn't answer. His silence was not weakness, it was discipline. Yet beneath that controlled exterior, something old stirred, unwelcome and raw. Memories he had carried for decades. Boys in Mississippi classrooms curling their mouths around his accent like it was dirt. Teachers sighing, telling him to speak properly. The sting of second-hand clothes, the taste of shame when his family had nothing but handouts. It was never just about words. The mockery always reached deeper, scratching at the fragile dignity of a child who wanted to be more than the town thought he could be. Fame had muted those voices, but never erased them. And now, here in a dingy diner far from the polished stages, they found him again, wearing a young man's smirk. The truckers sat stiff in their seats. One muttered under his breath, too low for anyone but his companion to hear, "That boy's asking for trouble." The tourists held their maps like shields, uncertain whether to flee or witness history. Even the waitress behind the counter clutched her coffee pot too tightly, her knuckles white. The room's unease became a presence of its own, pressing against the walls, trapping everyone inside. It was no longer just about one man mocking another. It had become something symbolic, primal, the ordinary taking aim at the extraordinary, and the extraordinary refusing, so far, to strike back. The veteran's voice broke in again, softer now, almost pleading. "You ought to think before you open your mouth, boy. This man's music pulled soldiers through more nights than I can count. He don't need your respect, but you sure as hell ought to give it." The boy's jaw clenched. His bravado had thinned, but pride kept him from backing down. He spat out, "I'm just saying what I see." Ain't nothing royal about sittin' in a diner, eatin' burgers with the rest of us. The words rang hollow, but they clung to the air like smoke. Elvis remained motionless, though the storm inside him swelled. He wasn't angry in the way most men were angry, loud, hot, immediate. His was a quiet burn, heavy with memory, restrained by years of needing to keep his composure under brighter lights than these. But the silence could not last forever. Every person in that diner knew it. The boy had struck at something deeper than celebrity. He had reached back into a life Elvis had tried to outgrow, but never could. The weight of it sat heavy in the room, pressing everyone toward the inevitable. And so they waited, hushed and wide-eyed, for the moment when stillness would finally give way to action. The silence stretched so long it felt like the walls themselves were holding their breath. The boy's last words, flung out with hollow bravado, still hovered in the air, brittle as glass. Every eye in the diner was fixed on the man at the window booth. Elvis hadn't spoken, hadn't moved more than a breath, yet the weight of expectation pressed on him as though he were back under the spotlights of a 1,000-seat theater. Only this was no stage. This was smaller, rawer, inescapably real. At last, he slid his palms against the edge of the table and rose. The motion was unhurried, deliberate, every muscle controlled. He didn't slam his chair back, didn't puff his chest or clench his fists. His strength came not from noise, but from restraint. The scrape of the chair legs against the floor was enough to send a shiver through the room. A fork clinked against a plate, abandoned mid-air. Even the jukebox, though silent, seemed to wait. He stepped forward, the soles of his shoes whispering against the linoleum, and came to stand just a breath away from the young waiter. The boy tried to keep his smirk, but it faltered under the steady gaze. Elvis's eyes were not angry, not cold. They were steady in a way that unsettled more deeply than rage ever could. When he spoke, his voice was low, each syllable drawn out in that unmistakable Southern cadence the boy had mocked. Cheeseburger, fries, coffee, black. There was no apology in the words, no attempt to disguise the drawl. Instead, he leaned into it, every vowel stretched like a banner unfurled. What had been used against him as ridicule became, in his mouth, a statement of defiance. The room absorbed the sound, and for a heartbeat, it seemed that the very air vibrated with it. Elvis let the words hang, then shifted his gaze across the room, not just at the boy, but at everyone present. His voice carried farther now, warm, yet edged with steel. You hear the way I talk? That's the sound of the dirt roads where I was born. That's my mama's voice calling me home for supper. That's church on Sunday morning in a shack with no paint on the walls, but hymns that reached higher than any roof. This voice is where I come from, and without it, there'd be no songs, no records, no concerts, no nothing. Every note I ever sang came from that same ground. A murmur rippled through the room. Some lowered their eyes, ashamed they had laughed even briefly. Others blinked hard, caught off guard by the raw honesty that spilled not like a performance, but like a truth too long carried in silence. Elvis's throat tightened, but he didn't let it stop him. He drew in a breath, and before anyone could expect it, he began to hum. The sound was quiet at first, barely more than a thread, yet it cut through the heavy air with uncanny clarity. The melody was old, older than fame, one of the gospel tunes he had learned as a boy, sung barefoot with neighbors on hot Mississippi evenings. The hum deepened into words, his voice tender, unpolished, stripped of the stage's grandeur. It was not meant to entertain, but to testify. The notes bent with memory, carrying sorrow and hope together. And in that small diner, something shifted. The tourists lowered their maps, transfixed. The truckers leaned forward, faces softened, one of them brushing quickly at his cheek, as though dust had gotten into his eye. Even the waitress forgot the coffee pot in her hands, letting it cool while she listened. By the time he let the last note fade, the room was no longer a diner. It was a sanctuary, held together by the shared silence of people who felt they had been allowed a glimpse into something sacred. The young waiter's cheeks burned crimson. His smirk had vanished entirely. He shifted his weight, looking for somewhere to put his hands, somewhere to hide from the eyes now fixed not on him, but on the man he had mocked. Elvis didn't smile in triumph. He didn't need to. The song had said more than victory ever could. He turned slightly, his profile illuminated by the tired neon spilling through the window, and it was suddenly clear to everyone that what they had witnessed wasn't about fame. It was about a man refusing to let his past be turned into a punchline. For years he had carried the sting of ridicule, tucked beneath the roar of adoration. Here, with nothing but his voice and the memory of his roots, he reclaimed it. He stood not as the idol from billboards, but as the boy from Tupelo who had survived the laughter and turned it into music that refused to die. The room, once restless and divided, now belonged to him entirely. And though he had raised no hand, spoken no threat, it was clear. The power lay with the man who had answered mockery not with anger, but with truth. The young waiter swallowed hard, his confidence unraveling thread by thread. He had meant to belittle, to entertain at another's expense, but instead he had become small, exposed. Every face in the room was turned toward Elvis now, eyes glistening, lips parted in awe. And in that instant, it became clear that this was no longer a scuffle over a silly accent. It was something greater, a moment where dignity stood taller than insult, where one man's quiet strength bent the entire atmosphere around him. For a long beat, no one dared move. The final breath of the hymn still seemed to hang over the counter, a faint vibration inside the glass sugar shakers and the chrome napkin holder. Then the room exhaled all at once, soft, uneven, a rustle of sleeves and throats being cleared for lack of a better response. It wasn't applause. It wasn't chatter. It was the human body remembering how to continue after being stilled. In the back booth, an older woman pressed a handkerchief to her mouth. The cloth trembled. She stood with careful dignity, as if a sudden motion might break something precious inside her, and crossed the aisle with the small steps of someone who had learned to carry sorrow without spilling it. When she reached his table, she looked up, eyes glossy but steady. "That song," she managed, the pitch of her voice thin as wire. "They sang it for my Henry." She swallowed. "We buried him in '68. Marines brought him home. They stood straight as fence posts, and a church friend sang. Just like that. Same turn in the notes." Her free hand hovered in the air, searching for a place to rest. "I hear it and I see the flag over the casket again. But it doesn't hurt the way it used to." Not tonight. Elvis's jaw tightened. Not with pain, but to hold back anything that might cheapen her courage. He kept his eyes on hers. "Ma'am," he said softly, "thank you for letting me know his name." He didn't touch her hand. He knew better than to make a scene of comfort. But he inclined his head the way Southern men did at gravesides. A private salute meant for the living as much as the dead. The diner changed shape around that exchange. The truckers straightened like they were back on the road and had just spotted a patrol car. Tourists eased their maps flat, pushing them away, suddenly embarrassed by their bright lines and cartoon landmarks. The waitress behind the counter set the coffee pot down with deliberate care, as if anything clattered would be an insult. From near the register came the scrape of a stool. The young waiter had gone pale under his desert tan. For a second, his mouth opened and closed without sound. Then pride found a foothold. "Now, hold on," he said to the room, louder than necessary. "You all act like a man's just cured polio with a hum." He sang, "Fine. Folks sing in here all the time. Don't make him more than he is." He snorted, reaching for a rag and wiping an already clean spot on the counter. "He's an entertainer." That's it. You all are just starstruck. No one answered. Silence can be a verdict. The boy's shoulders rose, defensive. He leaned forward on his elbows, trying to make the counter a barrier he could fight from. "Y'all know what he gets paid? While you're counting pennies for pie?" His voice sharpened. "He ain't your savior." The veteran in the army jacket, the man who had stood earlier, shifted as if to speak. But Elvis was quicker in a way that required no speed at all. He turned toward the counter, hands open at his sides, and said with a gentleness that undercut the room's growing anger, "Let him talk." That took the heat out of several faces at once. You could see it. Shoulders settling, fists unclenching beneath tables. The boy's eyes flicked to Elvis, wary. He'd expected either shame or fury, not permission. The older woman still by the booth found her breath. "Son," she told the waiter quietly, "you don't have to like anyone. But be mindful what you trample when you step on somebody's voice." She folded her damp handkerchief carefully. "Some of us live on what certain songs left in us." The boy flushed deeper, but stubbornness pushed him on. "I'm just saying what's true. He ain't special. You make him special and forget your own lives. That's on you." The room bristled. Chairs shifted. Someone muttered the kind of word a mother would swat a mouth for, but Elvis lifted one palm a fraction, and the sound died. He didn't scold. His look was level, carrying a kind of invitation and a warning together. "We don't have to turn this into a spectacle." He spoke in a voice meant to travel only as far as it needed. "Nobody here owes me anything. Not a clap, not a kind word." He glanced toward the woman. "But we owe each other a certain care. That's all." The boy tried to laugh, brittle as ice in thin glass. "Care? Since when do you people care about a busboy's shift?" He raised his chin at the room. "Y'all ready to fight me because he hummed a church tune?" It was the wrong argument, and he knew it even as he made it. The veteran pushed himself up again, slower this time, age counting out the seconds in his knees. He didn't step forward. He just let his voice carry, quiet and flint-edged. "No one's fighting you, kid. We're just witnessing the difference between joking and smallness." The boy's jaw worked. His eyes darted, looking for a sympathetic face. He found none. Even the tourists, who had been careful not to choose a side, gazed down at their hands as if a decision had already been made for them by the better parts of themselves. Elvis broke the standstill before the mood could curdle. He turned to the woman. "May I sit with you a moment?" She nodded. They slid into the booth opposite each other like old neighbors on a porch swing. Air moved again. People let go of breaths they didn't realize they'd been holding. He didn't ask for details. He didn't press for the long version of the loss that had carved out the shape of her life. He only said, "You remember any line they spoke by the graveside?" Sometimes those stick. She smiled, not from happiness, but from recognizing the world's rare kindness when it shows up plain. Chaplain said, "We commend him to the Lord and to the country he served." And then my brother whispered, "We give him back to you, God," like we were returning a borrowed thing. Her eyes flicked with water. "I think about the borrowing when the house is too quiet." "That's a good word," he said. Borrowing. Across the room, the boy tried again, unable to stand the calm. So that's it? He croons, and you all weep, and I'm the villain? His voice pitched upward. Come on! The waitress stepped out from behind the counter, setting herself between the room and the boy without touching him, her apron strings hanging like white lines drawn in the dust. Billy, she said, using his name for the first time, fetch table 4 their pie. Leave the rest be. The command landed not as an order, but as a rescue rope. He looked at her, then at Elvis, and for the briefest moment his face showed something closer to fear than to anger. The panic of a young man who'd steered himself into water too deep and couldn't admit it. He reached for the steel pie server and fumbled it, the metal clanging against the cake stand. The sound was miserable and small. Elvis stood from the booth. His movement drew every gaze again, but this time there was softness in the watching. He turned, palms up, as if presenting the whole diner back to itself. Let's not make this cruel, he said, the drawl lighter now, like a breeze cutting the heat after sundown. We've all had nights when our better sense stayed home. The veteran gave a short, grateful nod. The truckers eased their elbows off their table, tension dropping from their backs. Even the jukebox, powerless and dusty, seemed less accusatory in the corner. Billy, the name suited him now that the waitress had said it aloud, stared at the floor and set pie plates down at table 4 with timid care. He wasn't ready to apologize. He wasn't ready for anything except to be left alone long enough to grow a new layer of skin. The urge in the room to lecture him was strong. You could feel it, like pressure in the ears when a storm front shifts. But Elvis's restraint held the barometer steady. He would not let the place turn into a courtroom. To keep it that way, he crossed back to his booth and sat, leaving space for conversation to return to normal. He didn't pick up a menu. He wasn't hungry for food anymore. The coffee, when it came, would be enough. A hot, plain thing to hold while the room's pulse found its ordinary rhythm. The older woman took her seat again, folding her hands over the handkerchief. A small smile, the kind that doesn't show teeth, found its way to her mouth. "Thank you," she said, and the words belonged to a dozen meanings. He answered with a slight tilt of his head. Then he looked around the diner as if accounting for every soul present, one by one, before setting his gaze on the young man behind the counter. There was no triumph in it, only an open horizon and a question the boy would have to answer for himself later, when no one was watching. Conversation resumed in scattered murmurs. The truckers negotiated miles and loads. The tourists, quieter now, planned a route with fewer neon promises and more daylight scenery. The veteran returned to his corner and wrapped his hands around a ceramic mug, the way men warm themselves at campfires. The waitress refilled cups without clatter, as if rehearsing gentleness. What might have broken, held. The urge to punish loosened and fell away. Elvis had steered them off a cliff they didn't have to discover at the bottom. The boy's words would bruise the night a while longer. Every room keeps a mark from an unkindness, but the bruise would fade faster for lack of fresh blows. When the coffee finally arrived, black as he'd asked for, he wrapped his fingers around it with a grateful steadiness, and the steam climbed into his face like a blessing. The first sip was not remarkable. That was its grace. It tasted exactly the way coffee tastes at late hours in rooms like this. Burnt at the edges, honest in the middle. The woman opposite him glanced toward the window, where the neon sign outside stumbled through its repeated promise. Eats. The letter T flickered, trying and failing to vanish. Funny, she said, half to herself. How light will burn out one piece at a time and keep on shining anyhow. He considered that. Most things worth keeping do. From the counter came the faint scrape of a pie server set down more gently this time. The boy's shoulders were lower. He didn't look up, but he wasn't hiding either. The room, having avoided the easy satisfaction of a public shaming, settled into a better kind of quiet, the kind that leaves people a chance to grow instead of merely shrink. Elvis blew across the surface of his coffee and let the heat touch his lips. The night outside went on flashing and fading, a carnival of promises and their afterlives. In here, the air was thick with fried onions and something else that didn't have a smell. Mercy, maybe, or the fragile peace that follows when a crowd chooses to be a community for 5 minutes. He let that be enough. The bell above the diner door gave a sharp metallic jangle, sudden enough to cut through the low murmur that had finally returned to the room. Heads turned in unison. The night air spilled in, carrying desert dust and the faint gasoline tang of a nearby station. A small group of young men stepped through, their boots heavy with travel, their shirts clinging to shoulders damp from the heat outside. They were loud in the careless way only the young can be after too many miles together, laughter bouncing off the tiled walls. Among them was one who silenced the noise without meaning to. His khaki uniform was wrinkled from the road, the creases of long flights and bus seats etched into the fabric. His cap was tucked under one arm. The faint outline of service ribbons decorated his chest. A few heads in the diner straightened when they saw him. The posture of recognition, of respect, held quietly but firmly. The soldier's eyes swept the room, casual at first, until they landed on the man by the window booth. Recognition struck him like a shock. He stopped in his tracks, boots scuffing against the floor. His friends, still laughing, noticed the halt and turned. They followed his gaze. The soldier's face broke into something raw and unguarded. "Sir," he said, voice cracking from disbelief. "Is it really you?" The room froze again, but this time the silence wasn't tense. It was electric. He stepped forward, cap pressed tighter under his arm. "I'm just back," he explained, his voice gathering strength. "From Nam. 2 weeks ago I was sitting in mud, scared out of my skin. Nights so dark you couldn't see your own hand, and the only thing that kept me from breaking was your voice." He swallowed hard, fighting the wave of memory. "Somebody in my unit had a tape. We passed it around, old and chewed up, but it played enough. I'd put that little player to my ear when the fire started, and just, hold on. Your songs got me through things I didn't think I'd live through." The young men behind him, his friends from home, had gone quiet. They looked at him differently now, pride cutting through the bravado. Applause erupted, spontaneous and uneven, from the truckers, from the tourists, from the woman still holding her handkerchief. The veteran in the corner lifted his mug in silent salute. The sound filled the diner, not the hollow clapping of a show, but the kind of acknowledgement people give when they see proof of endurance standing in front of them. The soldier shook his head, overwhelmed. "You'll never know, sir. You'll never know what it meant out there." His voice broke again, but he didn't flinch from it. All eyes went to Elvis. He didn't bow. He didn't make a grand gesture. He only stood, walked the short distance, and placed both hands gently on the soldier's shoulders. The applause slowed, then stopped as the room strained to hear. "I'm proud you're home," Elvis said simply, the words wrapped in that low drawl, steady and unembellished. "That's what matters most tonight." The soldier blinked fast, as though the room's smoke was stinging him. His friends clapped him on the back, embarrassed by their own wet eyes. Everyone expected Elvis to leave it there, to bask in the moment. Instead, he did something no one anticipated. He turned, and with a small motion of his hand, he beckoned toward the counter. "Billy," he said. The name landed softly, without anger. The boy who had mocked him earlier stiffened. He looked around, as though hoping the name belonged to another. But no, it was his. The eyes of the room swiveled toward him. His rag froze mid-wipe on the countertop. "Come sit a minute," Elvis said. His tone was quiet, almost conversational, but it carried an authority no one questioned. The request? No, the invitation sucked the air out of the room. People expected a reprimand, maybe a dismissal. Not this. Billy's face flushed under the scrutiny. He laughed nervously, shaking his head. I'm working." Elvis didn't move. "You can sit while they drink their coffee." "Nobody's in a rush." His voice carried no threat, no mockery. Just certainty. The boy hesitated, caught between pride and the strange pull of the moment. He looked at the waitress, who gave a small nod. The veteran's gaze was steady, waiting. Even the soldier had turned toward him, expectant. The whole diner leaned in on him until resistance felt more foolish than compliance. Slowly, awkwardly, Billy came around the counter. His steps were stiff, his eyes fixed on the floor. When he reached the booth, Elvis slid aside, making space beside him. The boy sat, perching on the edge like a man sitting on the gallows bench. The room was silent again, but this silence was different. Not heavy, not hostile. Curious. The kind of hush before something important is said. Billy's jaw tightened. He expected a lecture, maybe humiliation dressed as kindness. He braced himself for it. Instead, Elvis leaned closer, his voice dropping so low only the first few tables could hear. "Tell me," he asked, "where'd you grow up?" The boy blinked. "Here," he muttered. "Vegas, born and raised. You got family?" "Just my mom. Dad's gone." He shrugged, embarrassed by the admission. Elvis nodded slowly. "Work hard here?" "Yeah, 2 jobs, sometimes. This and gas station nights." The boy expected judgment, but none came. Only quiet questions that seemed to hold no trap. Elvis let the words settle, then said, "I know something about trying to make it from nothing." "You think I was raised with gold in my pockets?" Billy glanced up, curiosity breaking through his defensiveness. Elvis's eyes softened. "We had holes in our roof. I wore shoes till the soles split, and cardboard poked through. Kids at school laughed at my accent. Same way you did. They laughed at the way I dressed, too. Clothes my mama bought second-hand. I carried that shame a long time. Thought I'd never outrun it." The boy swallowed, his throat working visibly. His bravado cracked, if only for a moment. The diner remained hushed, no one daring to intrude. For them, it was as if the world had narrowed to 2 figures in a booth. One man who had conquered stages across the world, and one boy who hadn't yet conquered his own pride. The boy opened his mouth, but nothing came. Finally, in a voice hoarse and thin, he whispered, "I didn't mean it like that." Elvis shook his head gently. "You meant it enough. But I see myself in you more than you know. That's why I asked you to sit." The words landed not as rebuke, but as recognition. And that was what broke the boy more than anger ever could. He turned his face, hiding it in his palm, and for the first time that night, he muttered something that sounded like an apology. The soldier, still standing by the door, witnessed it all, his chest heaving with something beyond pride, beyond awe. The diner was no longer just a place to eat. It had become a chamber where dignity, forgiveness, and memory braided together in ways no one would ever forget. And in the center of it, was a man who refused to answer mockery with cruelty, who chose instead to pull the one who mocked him into the circle, offering not punishment, but understanding. The crowd might have wanted blood, but Elvis gave them something better. The room settled around their booth as if cushioned with cotton. Voices fell away in shreds until only the noise of the old cooler in the back remained, clicking on and off like a tired heartbeat. The soldier and his friends drifted to a table by the door, speaking in whispers out of respect for whatever had begun at the window. Forks scraped plates carefully, as though loudness might snap whatever slim thread held the place together. Elvis angled himself so he and the boy faced each other squarely. Up close, Billy looked younger than he had from behind the counter, cheeks still carrying the last softness of adolescence. A razor nick along the jaw where he'd hurried through a morning he couldn't afford to miss. He perched on the edge of the cushion like a man waiting to be dismissed. "You got a bus schedule to keep?" Elvis asked, not unkindly. Billy shook his head. "I'm on till 2. "Then we've time." The boy's eyes flicked around the room. "They're all watching." "They'll find better things to look at," Elvis said. "Let's talk." For a few seconds, neither spoke. A semi rolled past outside, its bass hum threading under the windows. The neon sign buzzed, hesitated, tried again. Billy stared at his hands. Grease stained the nail beds, the black line that doesn't come out with a single wash. "Where do you lay your head?" Elvis asked. "North of Charleston Boulevard," Billy said. "Little court behind a laundromat. 2 rooms. I sleep on a cot. You like it there? It's cheap and no one asks questions." "You help your mama with rent?" "Every month I can," he answered, almost defensive, then softened. "She cleans rooms over on Fremont." "Asthma's bad some days. I pick up the slack." Elvis nodded, absorbing each detail as if stacking bricks. "School?" "Dropped at 16. Didn't see the point. Couldn't sit still. I wanted wheels, money in my pocket." He worked his jaw. "Money never stays." "It doesn't when there's a hole in the bucket," Elvis said gently. "What would you have done if you'd stayed?" Billy gave a crooked shrug. "I don't think about it." Makes the shift feel longer. A waitress placed 2 coffees without comment and moved away. The steam climbed and vanished. Elvis didn't touch his cup yet. He kept his hands folded, wrists relaxed, the way a man sits at a table he isn't trying to conquer. "When I was your age," he said, "we moved so often the neighbors never learned our names. Roof leaked when it rained. I wore coats that had belonged to other boys, shoes that weren't sure they were shoes anymore." He smiled a little, not nostalgically, but as if reading from an old ledger. "Mama washed our shirts in a wash tub out back and hung 'em on a rope between 2 trees. If we had a good week, we ate meat on Sunday. If not, well, we stretched beans till Friday and said grace just the same." Billy's eyes rose. "You?" "Me," Elvis said. "People see the car, the suits, the stage. They think that's where a life begins. Mine didn't. Mine started in the cheap seats. When you laughed at the way I talk, it wasn't about grammar to me. It was about a 12-year-old who kept his head down in a schoolyard and wished his voice sounded like it belonged to somebody richer." The boy's face tightened. "I didn't think about it that way." "Most folks don't think about what they hit," Elvis replied. "They think about the sound it makes." Billy's mouth twitched, as though he might argue. Then he let it pass. He traced a crack in the formica with one finger, turning the movement into a confession. "I get sore when I see people come in here, show off, throw money around. Makes me feel small." He swallowed, the word catching. "You walked in, and I wanted to knock you down to size before you did it to me without even trying." Elvis didn't flinch from the honesty. I understand that. You do? He lifted the coffee and sipped. A man who's climbed a ladder still remembers splinters. Billy let out a breath that was almost a laugh. He seemed both relieved and ashamed. I was a jerk. You were a boy who thought armor was the same thing as pride, Elvis said. I've worn that suit. It doesn't breathe. Across the room, the older veteran shifted in his chair, not eavesdropping so much as holding space with his presence. The mother with the handkerchief dabbed at the corners of her eyes again and turned her gaze to the window, granting privacy that didn't quite exist. Tell me about your old man, Elvis asked softly. Gone, Billy said. Left when I was 9. Last postcard came from Barstow. Said he was chasing work. I chased nothing for a long time after that. He cleared his throat. Mom says to forgive him. Most days I figure he already took what I had to forgive. Elvis sat with that a moment, letting it settle. My daddy did time when I was little, he said evenly. We weren't bad people. We were people who got caught being poor. There's a difference. But a boy doesn't parse that. He just carries the weight until his back learns the shape of it. Billy's eyes shone now, not dramatically, just the way a person's eyes look when they are newly awake to themselves. How'd you stop carrying it? I didn't, Elvis said. I turned it into something I could lift in public. Music gave me a handle. He tilted his head. You got something like that? Used to draw, Billy said. Cars, mostly. Every fender I saw on the street. Teacher said I had an eye. Then the job at the station came and I started drawing oil stains instead. He tried to make a joke and couldn't find the shape of one. Bring a pencil back to your pocket, Elvis said. You don't owe the stain your future. Billy blinked, startled that such permission could be offered by a stranger and feel so much like a command. He swallowed again, the knot in his throat thinning. You didn't have to talk to me. I didn't have to come in here, Elvis said with the hint of a smile. But I was hungry for plain things. Plain things include telling a young man I know who he is, even when he forgets. The boy finally met his gaze straight on. I was wrong. That's a good beginning, Elvis said. The word snagged. He tried again, slower. I am sorry. Not just 'cause people looked at me. I'm sorry because I thought small and made everybody fit inside it. Elvis's face didn't turn triumphant. If anything, something like relief crossed it. Relief that the evening might end on its feet. I accept that, he said. Now, do one better. What's that? Find the part of your day that doesn't pay a dime, and do it anyway. Billy gave a choked sound that could have been a laugh or the start of tears. He rubbed one wrist with the other hand, a boy's self-consolation. You sound like a preacher. I've heard a few, Elvis said, amused. Some good, some loud. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a stub of pencil, the kind hotel clerks give out without erasers. He laid it on the table between them. Start with that. Draw your way out of a corner. The boy stared at the pencil as if it were a pass stamped at a train station. He touched it, then pulled his hand back, then picked it up for good. His fingers looked right holding it. The room seemed to feel that too. A murmur of approval went through the tables, faint and wordless. I'll bring your burger, Billy said, voice steadier. And coffee, fresh. I've got coffee, Elvis said, lifting his cup. Then I'll bring the burger, Billy insisted, needing to do something, anything, that resembled repair. He stood, then halted. Mr. Presley? Elvis raised an eyebrow. You sang like you were at somebody's table at home, not on a record. Billy said. I didn't know music could make a place different without changing anything in it. It can change the people in it, Elvis answered. Then the place follows. Billy nodded, throat working. He slid from the booth, squared his shoulders as if adjusting a coat that fit better now, and moved toward the kitchen pass. The waitress watched him go with a small, private smile that belonged to women who have seen boys become men in the span of a single shift. Elvis turned slightly and found the soldier watching from the door, cap in his lap, gratitude resting on his features like a light he hadn't earned, but was glad to stand in. Elvis tipped 2 fingers in the soldier's direction, a quiet acknowledgement between men who knew something about long nights. When the food arrived, Billy set the plate down with careful hands, as though the cheeseburger were a fragile thing. He hesitated. I can clock out 5 minutes early if you want me to. If you want to, talk more. We already said the important part, Elvis replied. You say the rest with what you do tomorrow. Billy nodded. The pencil flashed once between his fingers before he tucked it into his apron pocket like a promise. He stepped back, and the diner took a new breath. Conversations swelled. Easy again. Somebody fed nickels to the jukebox out of habit, then remembered it didn't work, and laughed. The veteran lifted his mug at Elvis in a second, smaller salute. The mother folded her handkerchief and put it away at last. Elvis took his first bite, chewed, and felt exactly what he had wanted when he left the stage. A moment that tasted honest. He glanced at the boy behind the counter who was wiping a table without rushing, lips moving faintly, as if sketching the outline of a car in his mind. A long night still waited beyond the glass. Lights, obligations, a hotel room where the carpet swallowed sound. But here, for a little while, 2 lives had met in the narrow space between pride and mercy, and found a way to pass each other without collision. That was enough to carry. The diner no longer carried the nervous energy it had when Elvis first stepped through the door. What had begun as a test of pride had softened into something altogether different, an atmosphere people didn't have a word for, but they felt it in their bones. The clatter of cutlery was subdued. Voices dropped into the register of reverence, and even the jukebox in the corner seemed less like a broken machine and more like a sentinel guarding the silence. Billy, once defiant, now moved between tables with a new shape to his body. The slump of his shoulders was gone. He wasn't walking like a man condemned, nor strutting to prove himself. Instead, he carried himself with the caution of someone entrusted with a fragile vessel. Each refill of coffee, each wiped table was done not as duty, but as intention. The pencil in his apron pocket, barely visible, seemed to tug him upright. Elvis watched without intruding. He ate his burger slowly, savoring each bite as if it were a reminder of why he had come here, to taste life stripped of grandeur. Between mouthfuls, he let his gaze travel. The soldier by the door still sat straight, his friends teasing him quietly, but their eyes softened whenever they looked at him. The older veteran had relaxed into his booth, the weight in his face lighter than before. The woman with the handkerchief now rested her hands calmly, her grief temporarily eased by the shared song. When Elvis finally pushed his plate away, he reached into his jacket pocket. His hand lingered there longer than seemed necessary, as though what he touched carried weight far heavier than cloth. The room sensed the change and instinctively hushed, forks pausing midair. He drew out a crumpled square of fabric, worn thin at the corners, soft with age, its pale color dulled by time. He turned it in his fingers before holding it up just enough for those nearby to see. I keep this with me, he said quietly. Been with me longer than the gold rings, longer than the cars, longer than the stages. His voice slowed, weighted not with performance, but with memory. It was my mama's, The word Mama caught in the air. His thumb brushed the seam where the stitching had loosened. She carried this handkerchief everywhere, at church, at work, even in the hospital when she was sick. After she passed, I kept it close. When crowds cheered so loud I couldn't hear myself think, I'd feel it in my pocket, and it reminded me I wasn't born in glitter. I was born in love that asked for nothing back. A silence more profound than applause followed. No one shifted in their seats. The tourists who had been restless now sat still as statues, their maps folded away, forgotten. Elvis's gaze found the woman who had spoken of her husband's funeral. Her eyes glistened again, though this time not from raw pain but from recognition. He stood, walked to her table, and extended the handkerchief. "You should have this," he said, voice low enough to feel personal, though the whole room strained to hear. "Tonight it belongs to you more than to me. My mama would have wanted it that way." Her lips parted in disbelief. "I can't take that." "You already did," he answered gently, placing it into her palm and closing her fingers around it. "It's yours." Her breath came unsteady, her shoulders shaking as she looked at the fabric clutched against her chest. Tears fell freely now, but her smile broke through them like sunlight splitting clouds. Around her, people dabbed their own eyes, unashamed. The soldier rose halfway to his feet, as if saluting, then sat back down when he realized no gesture could match the gravity of the moment. Billy froze by the counter, rag in hand, his mouth open slightly. Even he understood this wasn't theater. It wasn't a stunt. It was as intimate as passing down a family heirloom. Elvis returned to his booth without ceremony, leaving the woman to cradle the handkerchief in silence. He didn't need acknowledgement. The act was not meant to impress. It was meant to honor. That distinction transformed the atmosphere in the diner. No one dared break it with applause. Applause would have turned it into spectacle. Instead, a reverent quiet held them all together. For those few minutes, every person in the room felt less like strangers and more like kin, bound not by blood, but by having witnessed something unrepeatable. The neon outside sputtered on, indifferent to the sacredness within, but no one inside cared. They were elsewhere now, inside a story they would carry for the rest of their lives, the kind told in hushed tones years later to grandchildren who might not believe it. Billy wiped the same spot on the counter again and again, not because it needed cleaning, but because his hands trembled and he didn't know what else to do with them. The veteran looked at Elvis with an expression usually reserved for fallen comrades, a mix of respect, gratitude, and the ache of memory. Elvis leaned back, sipping the last of his coffee. His eyes were tired, but there was softness in them too. For a fleeting moment, the room saw not the icon plastered across billboards, but a son remembering his mother. A man willing to part with the one token that tethered him to the woman who had given him everything she had. In that fragile, quiet exchange, the diner had been transformed. It was no longer a greasy roadside stop with cracked tiles and a sputtering neon sign. It was a place where grief had found companionship, where mockery had bent into humility, where music had become prayer. The moment settled like dust after a long storm, gentle, inevitable, impossible to sweep away. Someone near the back cleared his throat, not to speak, but to test whether sound could re-enter the room without shattering it. It could. A murmur rose, the kind of soft rustle you hear in church when a congregation senses a turn. People shifted, not from impatience, but from the quiet energy that follows a gift. The woman held the handkerchief to her heart. The veteran's eyes were far away and present at once. Billy stood motionless, as if a new gravity had found him. From a corner booth, A man in a short brim hat lifted a guitar case onto the vinyl seat. He'd been invisible until now, one of those Vegas sidemen who work lounges for tips and drink tickets, the sort of musician who knows every standard and gets named by nobody. Next to him sat a thin fellow with calloused fingers and the square shoulders of a drummer who's carried his own snare across too many parking lots. Their plates were empty, their checks unpaid. The guitarist glanced at Elvis as if asking permission to breathe. A voice from the middle of the room, no one ever agreed later whose it was, said, "Would you sing us one all the way through?" Not a demand, not a cheer, a request offered with the care you use when setting down crystal. Elvis didn't answer at once. His hand rested on the table, fingers tapping once, twice, the way a man checks the cadence of his own pulse. He'd sung enough for 10 lifetimes, and sometimes the songs felt like a net thrown over him by people who loved him, in a way that left little air. But tonight wasn't that. Tonight was simpler. He looked at the guitarist. The man's eyes widened. He sprang up so fast his hat nearly slid off. "Sir," he said, voice catching. She's tuned low, but—" Elvis stepped closer. "Mind if I borrow her?" The man opened the case with reverence usually reserved for old Bibles. Inside lay a road-weary hollow body, the finish dulled where palms had sweated through summers. Elvis lifted it, felt the weight settle against his chest. Thumb tested a string, then another. He rolled the tuning pegs a hair, listening with the patience of someone who has spent hours reconciling instruments to air. The drummer's foot began to mark time on instinct alone, heel soft against the tile. He looked around the room, not surveying, not counting heads, but acknowledging. The soldier by the door straightened. Billy set his rag down, backing toward the counter, unsure where to put his hands. The neon outside buzzed. Some fly knocked itself senseless against the window pane and gave up. The room belonged to the present. "What do you want to hear?" Elvis asked, not to grandstand, but to give the moment a shape. The call came from the veteran, sure and steady. "Start at the beginning." A smile ghosted across Elvis's mouth. He nodded, as if greeting an old friend only he could see. His right hand found the easy, pulsing strum he'd carried out of a Memphis studio in '54, when so few people believed this wild hybrid had a name. The first chords were spare and bright, the kind that made your foot beat time before your mind thought to permit it. He didn't chase perfection, he chased feel. The drummer, without sticks, tapped index fingers against his knees, and somehow it was enough. A heartbeat beneath the swing. He opened his mouth and let the words ride that shuffle. No theatrics, no curled lip, no wink. Just the sound of a boy grown into a man, returning to the crossroads that had set him running. He leaned into the phrases, not copying the old recording, but greeting it. Lighter here, rougher there, as if he were walking back through the house of his youth, touching door frames, checking the height marks, a pencil once scratched into paint. People smiled without noticing they were smiling. Shoulders loosened. The soldier's friends began patting 2 and 4 on the tabletop. The tourists forgot their maps entirely. The woman with the handkerchief closed her eyes and rocked just slightly. Not because the song was dance music, but because the body remembers relief as motion. Billy's mouth formed the rhythm silently, his head keeping time like his life depended on it. And in a way, some new part of it did. Halfway through, the guitarist slid back into his seat and played along without getting in the way, filling cracks with small, respectful phrases. Elvis glanced his way once, gratitude, a private nod, and the man answered with a phrase that sounded like a thank you. The drummer muted his taps when the lyrics tightened, then lifted them gently as the chorus came round again. Smiles gave way to something warmer, deeper. The song didn't need explanation. It didn't belong to an era or a chart position anymore. It belonged to the room that held it now. When he reached the end, he didn't tack on a flourish. He let the last chord ring just long enough for everyone to carry a piece of it, then laid his palm over the strings to still them. Silence returned, not empty, but full. No one clapped at first. Then the veteran brought his hands together once, twice, like a signal that it was safe, and the room followed. Not the spiky racket of a showroom, but a rolling human gratitude that rose and fell and left space for breath. Elvis lifted the guitar slightly in thanks, then returned it as carefully as it had been given. The guitarist swallowed hard, whispering, "I'll never forget this," as if scared the moment might hear and vanish. He turned toward the counter, toward the boy who had started the night by trying to make a man smaller to feel taller himself. Billy stepped forward, then stopped. Then came the rest of the way with the humble bravery of someone who knows the right thing only because all the wrong ones have fallen away. "I'm sorry, sir," he said, voice plain. No explanation. No if. No but. Just the sentence a man can live with. Elvis reached out and laid a hand on his shoulder. No sermon. No show. The gesture said what needed saying. Error acknowledged, debt canceled, go make good with the hours you've got left. Billy's face crumpled and then steadied. He nodded once, a vow sealed without fanfare. The soldier stood, cap in hand, as if to volunteer a toast, then thought better of it. He looked younger than when he'd walked in, as though the song had rinsed a layer of grit from him that even a homecoming couldn't. His friends squeezed his shoulder, proud and unsure how to carry the moment without dropping it. Elvis stepped back to his booth. The waitress, who had seen so many nights in this city blur into one another, poured him a fresh cup without asking. "On the house," she murmured, "because there are times when ledger books don't matter." He held the mug, letting the heat settle into his fingers. Around him, the room resumed the business of being a room. Pie plates scraped clean, checks signed, chairs scuffed. But nothing was exactly as it had been before. The air had a new clarity, the way it feels after a storm passes, and you realize the horizon was closer all along. The guitarist closed his case like a ceremony. The drummer tucked his hands under his thighs, as if to keep them from speaking out of turn. The veteran leaned back and exhaled through his nose, a small sound full of satisfaction. The woman with the handkerchief folded it carefully, then unfolded it again, as if to assure herself it was real. Billy returned to the counter lighter by several invisible pounds. He picked up a pencil that now had a history and drew a line on the order pad's margin, a curve, then another, eyes narrowing with concentration, the world around him momentarily reduced to form and possibility. It wasn't much, but it was a beginning shaped like hope. Outside, the city kept pulsing. Dice rattled, slots chimed. The Strip sold its bright promise to whoever needed it. Inside, a different promise had been made and kept. That music could put a room back together. That mercy could change a narrative mid-sentence. That a man could return to where he started and find the first door still open. Elvis took a slow sip. The coffee tasted exactly like coffee in a place like this should taste. Nothing fancy, everything honest. He set the cup down and rested his palm on the worn table, feeling the tremor of lingering vibrations that only he could sense. He didn't claim the moment. He didn't hold it hostage with a final word. He let it belong to everyone who had risked believing in it. And then he looked up, ready for whatever the night would ask next. When the last notes had settled into memory, the diner seemed to hover in a rare stillness, a silence neither heavy nor empty, but full, like a vessel brimming to the lip. People sat straighter, not from formality, but from an instinct that told them they had been part of something irretrievable once it passed. Elvis set his cup down and rose, slow and unhurried. The scrape of the chair was the only sound, yet it carried more weight than an ovation. He placed a few bills on the table, far more than his meal could have cost, and slid them toward the edge with a finality that said no discussion would be had. Then he lifted his hand, palm down, requesting quiet, though the room had already given it. "You know," he began, voice low but clear, "there'll always be someone who don't like the way you talk, or the way you walk, or the place you came from. They'll laugh at the clothes you wore, or the way your mama raised you, or the things you believed before you knew better. But that's not what defines you. What defines you is whether you keep what's yours anyway. Your roots, your sound, your story." His eyes moved from face to face, never rushing, never dramatic. If you try to throw all that away just to fit into somebody else's picture, you lose the only thing you've got that can't be stolen. Don't trade your voice for silence. It's the one gift you're born carrying. The soldier by the door swallowed hard, pressing his cap tighter under his arm. The woman clutched the handkerchief as if it had been stitched into her palm. Billy leaned on the counter, chin down, every word hammering a nail into a framework he'd build on later. Elvis let the message settle. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added, "And don't mistake the shine for the gold. I've stood in front of crowds so loud you couldn't hear yourself think. But some nights—" He glanced around the cracked tiles, the flickering neon visible through the glass. "Some nights it's here, in a place like this, where a man remembers why he ever sang at all." No applause followed. No one wanted to reduce it to performance. People nodded instead, a ripple of acknowledgement passing through the room like a current of shared resolve. He turned toward the counter, caught Billy's gaze, and gave him a small nod. Not approval, not dismissal, just a recognition that said, "The rest is in your hands now." Then he moved toward the door. The soldier jumped up as if to open it for him, but Elvis placed a hand on his forearm. "Sit, son," he murmured. "Enjoy being home." The young man obeyed, though his posture stayed ramrod straight, as though he had just been given orders he would never disobey. Elvis pushed the door open. The bell clanged once, sharp against the night. Cool desert air spilled in, carrying the smell of gasoline and asphalt. He stepped through, the lights of the Strip flickering in the distance, gaudy and relentless. Behind him, no one spoke. The hush was the only way they knew to honor what had happened. Outside, the parking lot lay half empty, oil stains shining like black mirrors under the lamps. A Cadillac waited, chrome catching what little glow the diner threw off. Elvis walked to it, with the measured gait of a man returning to a role he had never fully chosen, but could never set down. One man followed him out, the quiet type, a factory worker in a denim jacket who had sat unnoticed all evening, eating his pie in silence. He paused on the threshold, unsure if he should intrude, but something urged him forward. He stopped a few yards away, just enough to see without being seen. Elvis slid into the driver's seat and closed the door. For a moment, he rested his forehead against the wheel. His shoulders sagged, the proud carriage gone. The neon glow through the windshield revealed not the legend, not the king, but a man worn thin by the weight of expectation. A man who had given away more of himself tonight than he could ever recover. The observer felt his chest tighten. He had just seen greatness, but what lingered now was not the memory of the song or the sermon, but the image of a man utterly alone in the pause between public glory and private silence. Elvis lifted his head, started the engine, and the Cadillac rumbled to life. He glanced once toward the diner window, where faces still hovered in awe. Then he turned away, guiding the car toward the Strip, toward the blaze of lights that demanded him back. The man in the denim jacket stood in the lot long after the taillights disappeared. He knew he would tell this story for the rest of his life, but he also knew no one would ever fully understand. Because what mattered most wasn't the music, or the forgiveness, or even the handkerchief passed from one grieving soul to another. What mattered was the glimpse of the truth behind the myth, that even kings grow weary, that even the brightest light longs for darkness where it can rest unseen. Inside, the diner slowly came back to life. Coffee was poured, forks clinked, chairs squeaked against linoleum. People would carry on, but none of them would ever forget the night when the ordinary world cracked open and something extraordinary stepped through, only to walk out again, leaving the air changed forever.